Good evening, everyone. I'm Liz Baldwin, and I am a senior librarian here at SNFL. Welcome to Understanding AI, the environmental costs of AI are surging. What now? Tonight's event is the second program in our series, Understanding AI in Collaboration with Data and Society. We are delighted to have you all join us tonight at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library, whether you're joining us in person or online. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's conversation possible. Before handing the event over to our moderator, I would like to encourage you all to visit our website to check out future events in this series and other 7 Stories Up programs happening this fall. Join me now in welcoming our moderator for this evening, Tamara Kneese.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. So thank you all so much for coming, and thank you also to our wonderful partner, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. So I wanted to do a little bit of scene setting today before we begin with our conversation. All of us are drowning in contradictory messages about AI. We hear that it will simultaneously create prosperity and mass unemployment. We hear that it will solve and worsen climate problems, revolutionize healthcare while also endangering our children through harmful chatbots. Meanwhile, right now, we're all living with AI's real impacts. Creative workers are losing their jobs. AI is being introduced in K-12 schools and higher ed, and communities are grappling with AI data centers popping up in their backyards. Yet many of us also find tools like ChatGPT genuinely useful in our everyday lives. How should we make sense of these tools, their social impacts, and the politics surrounding them? Sorry, balancing. As a publicly funded research and policy institute, Data and Society centers the public interest in our work, just like our partner. So what does it mean to understand AI through the lens of the public's interest, rather than the interests of large corporations that dominate the media and PR landscape? We're very excited that you're here to join us in this effort to tell a different story about AI. Today's conversation is about AI and the environment, and we have 2 more events coming up this fall in October and November. We hope that you'll join us for all 4 sessions. AI's environmental impacts have come under public scrutiny. While we might see different estimations of how much one ChatGPT query costs in terms of carbon emissions, energy use, or water use, today we're going to think about AI as an ecology. AI is an infrastructure, and AI is a form of power, and we'll unpack all of those things for you, don't worry. How are communities around the world being affected by the growth of AI infrastructures like data centers, and their various repercussions for public health and the environment? And how can communities fight back against powerful tech companies and their interests? I'm joined today by 2 leading experts in the field to help us understand these complex relationships. First, we have Jasmine McNealy, who is an attorney, critical public interest technologist, and social scientist who studies emerging media and technology with a view toward influencing law and policy. And also Sanjana Paul, who is an engineer, environmental justice researcher, and a systems thinker working at the intersection of infrastructure, climate, and technology. So I thought that we should begin the conversation by introducing ourselves a little bit and telling you all where we're coming from and why we're all researching and organizing around AI's environmental impacts. So personally, I worked on a sustainability team within a large tech company, but in my current role as a research and policy nonprofit person, I am interested in helping engineers within tech companies better understand how the technologies that they're designing might affect people, even people who are not directly using the products that they put out. While tech companies usually do release metrics about the energy efficiency of AI models that they produce, and they might think about the impacts of the technologies that they create on users, people who are directly using their products, they don't usually think about the downstream impacts on the communities who live next door to a massive data center or an e-waste site. So much of my work at Data and Society focuses on public participation in technology development and assessment as a form of accountability, trying to figure out not only how to measure particular kinds of harms that technology may cause, but also looking at how we might mitigate them through collective action. So how did each of you get involved in the research that you're doing around AI's environmental impacts? And what are the big projects that you're focused on right now? Should we start with Sanjana?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, everyone. Very excited to be here. So yeah, I mean, I came into this work broadly through thinking about questions at the intersection of environmental justice and technology. I have a background in electrical engineering, and I used to be an environmental sensing scientist. So I studied air quality. I built tools for scientists studying air quality, and I recently switched fields to go into energy and energy policy. And I was just really fascinated because I think data centers are such a nexus of all of these different questions. There are air quality and environmental degradation issues. There are electricity and like facility siting issues. And so I'm really interested in data centers as a pressing environmental justice question in the 21st century and how we think about it explicitly with an EJ framing. I run an organization called the Rooted Futures Lab, which works at the intersection of environmental justice and tech. And we just actually launched a Data Centers and EJ program where we're focused on building a dashboard for local policymakers and activists who are working around, let's say, local data center siting and trying to think about how we can build technology that's in the public interest in accordance with what we've developed environmental justice and tech principles. So that's kind of my framing as I'm coming into this, trying to tie a whole bunch of different threads together. And I'm never bored because there's a lot going on in this space.
Jasmine McNealy, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Evening. I am on faculty at the University of Florida, and I also direct the Infrastructure for Communities, Ecology for Data hub, which focuses a lot on the implications, the impacts of technology, including artificial intelligence. In 2023 through 2024, I was a senior fellow at Mozilla, and my project focused on rural artificial intelligence, and that is the implications of AI for rural communities, not that it doesn't have implications for urban communities at all, but for a community that is marginalized differently than urban settings. What does artificial intelligence mean? How do people want or not want artificial intelligence and the associated infrastructure, including the data, to be used and used against them? And what are the influences happening currently? And of course, climate, environment, waste, pollution are all a part of that conversation. And there is a dearth of real talking about that. Of course, there's a talk about the use of artificial intelligence in the agricultural sector for productivity and sensing, but not about the implications or the impacts of it on water, land, labor, and all of the connected things. And so that's my interest.
Yeah, thank you. That is such a good segue to the next question also. And I think this idea that we hear a refrain over and over again of AI for climate, that we're going to build more AI to help mitigate climate change and solve day-to-day environmental problems, and yet we see the giant costs of AI really not factored in to that kind of calculation. So Jasmine, as we were talking about in our pre-meeting, we were really thinking about AI as an ecology and the fact that it relies, of course, on global supply chains. So, we might think about AI as the way that we, interface with it. We might think of it as a text-based chatbot that we interact with on a phone or a laptop, or an image that we generate through a prompt. But of course, it is actually connected to networks of labor, and it depends on a whole host of natural resources and material realities, while also being informed by social inequalities. I often think about the fact that the communities that are becoming sites for data center investment, particularly in states where there's a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure, but also not a lot of connectivity for the folks who actually live there, and the people who are also dealing with critical mining operations as well, are really not necessarily benefiting economically and may not even have digital access or connectivity. So how do both of you situate, though, the environmental impacts of AI? What does the public need to know? Jasmine, we'll start with you this time.
Oh, I mean, there's so much to know, right, about the environmental climate and I would say life and public health impacts of not just data centers or server farms. Remember they were called server farms back in the day, but also about the other uses of artificial intelligence that are not necessarily data center connected, but have environmental implications, right? I think that the public should know, one, whenever there is new, I'm going to say, a new technology, there's always, that technology is always connected to a person, place, or thing, and it always touches several other persons, people, or things in particular communities. And when there has to be infrastructure for a technology, that infrastructure has to go somewhere, and it will impact. It's not if it will impact the community where it's set. Now, in the case of artificial intelligence, it is, I would say, only amplifying the impact of already polluting infrastructure, already infrastructure that already has public health implications, whether it's for particulates like respiratory particulates or water and access and water pollution. Also, if we think further into where the minerals that we use for technology to be built come from and that environmental impact. So there's a lot of connections that are there that fade into the background that we don't recognize. But if we start making the connections, we can start looking at these larger and long-term and short-term impacts on different communities with regard to the environment.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like everything you said, absolutely. I think a phrase that I say a lot at Rooted Futures Lab when we teach students is that the internet is a place. I think that there is on purpose a lot of language that kind of obfuscates or kind of is really vague in terms of like, what are we even talking about? Like AI, it's in the cloud, don't worry about it. And so I think that vagueness might be on purpose sometimes, to kind of maybe not really get into the specifics of what the actual impact is. But I agree that there is so much to know. I think that in the climate and environmental space, sometimes there's a tendency to really put a lot of weight into information gaps. Oh, if only we knew a little bit more about climate change, then we would have action. When in reality, perhaps we've known about climate change since before I was born, and it's really kind of like power structures and that are holding us back from moving forward. But I actually do think that when it comes to the material impacts of AI, there is a legitimate information gap because of that vagueness and that obfuscation, and that local government officials, for example, and people on the ground who are trying to decide, does our community want this data center? What is it going to do? Is it actually beneficial to us? I do think that there's legitimately a lot of confusion about, wait, sorry, we're in Arizona. Climate change is making drought more. Is this actually going to affect like the water in my kid's school? Like, how do we know that? Do these tech companies who are building data centers treat this as a trade secret and kind of get away with it in that way? So I think that there's so much to know, and that could be a 3-hour conversation in and of itself. And we're trying to build this dashboard at Rooted Futures Lab to be kind of a clearinghouse for a lot of this data in the same place to be able to help fill a little bit of that information gap and then move us forward into kind of challenging some of those power structures.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting when we're talking about the role of data centers right now. So just quickly, I wanted to gauge. I know that a lot of you are also probably in town for Climate Week, so the results might be a little bit skewed. But have we all like a basic working definition of what a data center is? Ish, yeah? Has anyone actually been to a data center? do you see one regularly where you are? There aren't many that are like visible in New York City, but so this is something that is not totally new, right? Like we need data centers to power the internet in general. And the idea that you have these basic like massive warehouses that are full of servers to run cloud computing, this is not a new concept, and they took energy and water before, but what we're seeing right now is a massive investment and a massive expansion, both from tech companies and from governments. And so I think maybe we could put into perspective a little bit. Maybe we can get into the nitty gritty details that I feel like all of us swim in it to the point where maybe we're not articulating it all the time. But what are the ramifications? So like what is actually happening on the ground? What does it mean if a, really massive hyperscaler is permitted in your area, and what does it mean for things like housing or agriculture or other forms of land use? What are the ramifications? Of course, Jasmine, your work is more focused on water, and Sanjana, yours is on energy. So thinking about what this means for people in their everyday lives. So what are some of the pressing issues that you see? And I just want to throw out a statistic. So the International Energy Agency has forecasted that global data center energy consumption will more than double by 2030. And the fact of the matter is that companies are really intensifying fossil fuel production, in part because of their relationships to oil and gas companies, which we have the folks from Enabled Emissions campaign in the room with us today, who are focused on the fact that AI is not just a problem because of the energy that it consumes in data centers, but also the applications of AI. When tech companies are partnering with oil and gas, what does that mean? When they're accelerating the exploration and drilling of oil. So what are some of the issues that you think people really need to know about?
Man, where to begin? I think actually where to begin is maybe just one word that has a lot of different meanings. Is I like to just run into the room and just be like, power. We need to think about power in like many senses of the word, right? I want you to think about electric power for sure, because there is global data center demand. And I think like in the United States specifically, don't 100% quote me on this, but I think that there's a forecast that data centers could consume up to like 12% of our country's electricity or something. And it's really interesting because I'm in kind of like the electric grid and transmission space, and there's all of this talk about, this technology or this approach called demand response, which is shifting around electricity loads in time and space, and ideas about data centers actually being a really big part of that and enabling kind of like a flexible grid that's optimized for renewable energy. And I think that's really interesting because I'm a demand response fangirl. I think that we should be doing demand response. I think it's really cool. I think that, if there are data centers in the public interest, which is a whole different conversation, I think those data centers should definitely do demand response. But doing that does not address the deeper questions of like, should we actually be doing a free-for-all huge build-out of these data centers that is U-turning our country's energy policy and prioritizing that instead of things like housing at the state level? So, there are ways to kind of chip away at some of these issues around electricity use, maybe chip away at some of these issues around water, but we're not addressing that fundamental question about the other aspect of power, which is like, who is benefiting from this, right? Like, our five guys in Silicon Valley, is it really worth, the costs that are being imposed upon the public? So I think that there's a lot of kind of unpacking to do in terms of just like really basic engineering design process questions around like, what are we trying to do? What are the methods that we need to kind of pursue it? Who is benefiting from this? Where's the harm going because it goes somewhere? And kind of trying to understand how to make sense of that using frameworks, actually, I think that can come from the environmental justice movement, because I think that data centers are a really interesting example of locally undesirable land use, or the acronym is LULUs, which is very fun to say in like these very serious discussions, which is that like the idea is that this locally undesirable land use is presented as being, or it is kind of serving the broader public good, but the costs are concentrated on one specific neighborhood. And so that's a very complex conversation for things that we need to keep society running, like what do we do with our waste, right? And when you think about data centers, and again, who's reaping the benefits from this, I think to me it's kind of clear, but I think that it depends on the specifics of the situation. So yeah, I'll pause there, but there's a lot more to get into.
No, wonderful. This is really amazing answer. So I think quite about the kind of stratification of where data centers and other like e-waste sites go and what communities they're placed in, and then the implications for those communities who are already most of the time marginalized. So let's stack more marginalization on them, whether it's environmental, public health, of course, and other impacts that if we were looking at other industries, we mentioned oil and gas, we've seen those impacts with like cancer clusters and other asthma clusters and other kinds of impacts on the people surrounding those. And noted that many of them don't work for those organizations. They're just getting the awful, the runoff from those organizations, right? So we're talking about ecology. We connect the communities, the organizations, the data centers, but then we connect like the impacts as well, right? So environmental, public health, labor, and talking about zoning, right? So many of the campaigns to get a data center, they need to go through your local zoning. And the campaigns usually say, hey, this will bring so many jobs into this area. So we need to rezone, and we also want to have tax breaks for these organizations. At the same time, when we look at who's being hired from those communities, there's not a real good ratio there. It's usually people brought in with a certain level of expertise, or they just don't come with the amount of jobs that they promise. So this is an environmental issue as well, right? The environment of the community is not changed and actually is negatively affected by those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And just thinking about on a super mundane level, the fact that people who are living near data centers are also paying higher energy bills and higher water bills. And so, that can be a kind of galvanizing moment too, when people realize that they're really being screwed over by these companies that are promising their local officials more jobs, economic stimulation and growth. But in reality, not only are the tech companies getting massive subsidies that are undermining local, tax revenue anyway, but they're also not even producing many jobs for people there at the same time that people are paying higher bills. And I think, as you were pointing out, Jasmine, the public health impacts are just astonishing because, as we were talking about earlier, even though there's a lot of focus right now on renewable energy, and there's a lot of investment in things like nuclear energy. And folks like Sam Altman especially are, really hyping the possibilities of nuclear as a way to provide really abundant and maybe infinite forms of clean energy to power as much AI as they could want, and will just cover the earth with data centers. But I think what, the reality is that a lot of data centers are relying on things like coal and also on diesel-fueled backup generators because of the strains on the grid. And so, if you're living near these things, your, asthma is going to be affected. You're going to, deal with air quality issues and noise pollution. Like, these things are loud because of the fans that are used to, cool the systems. And, these are just like massive, massive things that take up a lot of space and really, change the landscape. And I think, when we're talking about the cloud, it can feel so abstract from these like very material realities. So I wanted to get into maybe a question of like, who is actually benefiting? And Sanjana, you were raising this question, right? And so, what is the role of the combination of tech companies, which we know are benefiting, and local governments, which we've also been talking about, is maybe, being enchanted by the lines they're being fed by tech, but also utility companies. How do these different actors kind of fit together? When we're thinking about who is benefiting. And also, maybe we can begin to think a little bit about where we've seen different kinds of resistance. So, what are the different strategies that people might pick up to start fighting back? I know that we have, slightly different perspectives here too, because Jasmine, you're really bringing a legal perspective and a policy perspective, and Sanjana, you have such a practical, engineering background too, which I think is amazing, and community focused engineering, which is really kind of groundbreaking. So thinking about, site fights and the ways that data centers have become really the material manifestation of kind of the people versus big tech. What can people do?
Well, I think to kind of get to that first question about, who's benefiting and thinking about all these different things, it's such a fascinating political economy question, right? Because I think it brings in a little bit of the idea of market making by the state, when you look at the federal level and kind of how tech companies and the federal government are working together. I think the benefits are so asymmetrical that it's kind of comical, honestly. Just to see how much, again, this very, very small group of people in Silicon Valley is just do not worry about it. AI will solve all your problems. And I think that we should be able to just kind of ask basic operational questions about how? When you say AI, what are you even talking about? It's using the word transportation and you're talking about a car and another person's talking about a bike and another person's talking about a rocket, right? Specificity is important. And I think getting into, some of the ideas around what can we do? What are people doing? I mean, there's so many really great examples we can look to. I know Louisiana is a site that has a legacy of a lot of extractive industries coming in and also a legacy of really groundbreaking, really courageous, really incredible frontline activism. I think also there's specific cases all over the country. I know that there was somewhere in Virginia, which is home to what's called Data Center Alley, which is one of the highest concentrations of data centers in the world. It's in Northern Virginia because there's a big subsea internet cable that's a very big sort of internet link that comes onshore in Virginia. And I think hopefully someone can fact check me on this. I think it was Pittsylvania County in Virginia where there was a big hyperscale data center that was being proposed that was going to be powered by gas turbines. And the local community actually just kind of treated it as a public health crisis. And we're just guys, this is bad. The particulate matter pollution, which as a former air quality researcher is bad for you, not only in terms of asthma and respiratory diseases, but particulate matter also contributes to neurodegenerative diseases. There are clear links forming around that. So it's just it's a horrible pollutant. And that community was able to, convince the zoning board, I think, that no, this is a public health crisis. We should not do this. And the data center didn't get approved. And so I think just kind of pointing out look, does this make sense, right? Everything has a cost. There's no such thing as a free lunch, as they say. Everything has an impact. But we can also be have a little bit of common sense around saying, okay, but this impact is horrifying. I think in Oregon, there was a bill that was passed to kind of try and stop the socializing of power costs onto ratepayers by the utility, and it's forcing data centers to actually own the energy costs of coming online, which it's kind of wacky that we had to have separate legislation for that, but that's again a separate conversation about our power system. So there's interesting ways, tackling different facets of the issue that different people can get involved depending on the specifics of the situation. Lean into that specificity, think about the public health angle, think about the energy bill angle, think about the water angle, think about the notion of the democratic deficit and wanting to participate in the democratic process about infrastructure in your neighborhood. So there's a lot we can do. We don't have to accept the inevitability of well, it's just going to happen, because Sam Altman said it's going to happen. And, we can actually have a role to play in the kind of society that we want to live in.
Absolutely. I think the exercise of your First Amendment rights are really fundamental to making sure that not just obviously data centers and environmental impacts of artificial intelligence are impacted, but just the entire power structure that facilitates the creation of these and spread of these systems work. So we talked about Oregon, but Oregon there was organizing to ensure that bill at least got introduced, and in Virginia there was organizing about the impacts of those alleys. In Georgia, there's organizing happening about like, do we want to have a nuclear power plant? And it's not. And there was a nuclear power plant promised in Georgia, and the utility company hasn't come in on their promise, and so you have people paying more rates. So there's organizing around that. So when people organize, we can impact systems of power to ensure that we are not harming each other more or amplifying the harm related to technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, oh my God, yeah. There's you got to have that relationship between community on the ground organizing and learning from environmental justice organizations that have been doing that work for a long time against a lot of different but similar foes. And then, also thinking about the policy responses. And I think what's been quite interesting, so my team's doing research in Virginia in Data Center Alley, and looking at how there's been just a ton of bills that have gone through Virginia. Not all of them have been successful, but the attempts at building more responsible data centers and trying to get the utility companies as well, like Dominion in Virginia, to behave and actually be transparent about what they're doing. And that's the other thing, is using legal mechanisms to force companies to be transparent. So using FOIA, getting information about permits, so air permits, trying to understand. A lot of people don't even realize which company is building a data center where they live, or even that it is a data center until it's pretty late in the process. But at the same time, if people are activated and they are aware, and you have people who are kind of looking out and watching the permitting process, and you maybe have people inside a local government who are also concerned and doing that work and activated to, inform local activist organizations too. You can have like 15 or 20 people showing up at a town hall. This is what organizers in Virginia have said. That's enough to show that people care, and that can really make a difference. So, getting people to turn out.
Yeah, I think it's to go along with the question you asked a couple of questions ago, which was, what do people need to know? Know your local government laws, right? So in Florida, we have we call them sunshine laws, which basically means public records and public meetings laws. So about notice when meetings are going to happen, what they're going to be talking about, but also the records of those meetings. And the law states in Florida, when there's 2 or 3 people on a committee that are together, that could be considered a meeting. And so knowing about the intricacies of your state public records, state public meetings is really important for organizing and keeping people in power and holding them to account.
Yeah, no, I mean, +1. Yeah, yeah. I think that's an important thing to remember. Is again going back to like this vagueness, right? Of like, oh, it's AI, it's inevitable. What are we even talking about? I just really want to encourage people to like challenge that and be curious, and really think about in specific terms, like what are we speaking about when we talk about AI? Why are we building infrastructure to support that vision of AI? Because I actually find that in many conversations, when the phrase AI, I can hardly even say it without just waving my hands around because it's really vague. When we start to speak about what AI can and can't do and what impacts it can or, can't have, a lot of times it's just a placeholder for issues that we have in society more broadly. Right? There's questions about who has power in society more broadly. What are we going to do about public health crises more broadly? And so if this is a jumping off point for you to get really deep into an issue area that you are passionate about, I think that's fantastic, because this is really a nexus of so many different issues in like so many different ways.
Yeah, definitely. We need more data. We need more information. We need more people activated and actually doing it. So now we will turn it over to the audience for any questions that they may have. I already see a hand. So I think the mics are going to go around. So feel free to raise your hand to ask a question, and the mics will be circulating. I think we have. Okay, sorry. Also, wanted to note that on your seat there's an index card, a material artifact, and you can ask a question or comment on something that resonated with you. And you can also, contribute anonymously that way if you'd rather do that instead of having a mic.
Hi, thank you very much for coming here and speaking with us today. This has been enlightening. I have two questions. We've spoken about the impacts, obviously, on the environment, the community surrounding, economic, whether good or bad, and health. So kind of the inverse to what you guys are speaking about, what is considered an ideal location then to have these data centers that would possibly lead to a win-win for both the community, the political, and the economic, and not have a terrible health impact? And also, I'm curious, as someone who lives in New York, we all deal with Con Ed, and I'd like to understand if some of those places like Oregon that you mentioned were able to some way somehow carve out the electrical use back so that it's traceable to them and it's not then going to be offset by raising the bill of the surrounding community. How would that happen in a place like New York, or has it happened in other places? So it's a twofold question, but I really want to understand what is the ideal location.
Yeah, no, that is a great question, because I think that it's very important, and like a core aspect of like our work at Rooted Futures Lab is like, yeah, what are we actually going to do, right? Because like there are a group of people who have like a pretty, in my view, not so great vision for the future. And how do we have a great vision for the future that also deals with these complicated realities? So, I mean, I think that one big like precondition for your question is just like scale and speed. Because again, like Tamara mentioned, data centers already exist. They have existed. They're a huge part of the internet, which I use every single day. And I think it's really just like this rapid, huge, fast build out for generative AI that is kind of a lot of where my angst is that it takes time to plan energy projects. It takes time to bring projects online. How long does it take to build renewable energy, for example, right? Apparently, we can build data centers really fast, and it takes us a long time to build carbon-free electricity projects. So I think to your question, like a good approach from my perspective, and going back to this question of how can a data center be in the public interest, don't hold me to this answer since this is a project that I'm still working on. One, it would just be like not rushing and actually being able to take the time to understand like where is a good site. I know, for example, Iowa is also seeing a lot of data center build out because they have a lot of wind energy. And so theoretically, sure, in a place that does have a lot of carbon-free electricity, you can plan a data center at a reasonable pace in a place where, there's not a lot of drought. There are mechanisms like community benefits agreements, which are by no means perfect, because it's complicated contract law and there's some inherent power dynamics in the negotiations. But you could have something like a community benefits agreement for a developer coming into a community to say, hey, what's up? I would like to use your land for this purpose. What would make it okay for me to use your land? Like, would you like a project labor agreement? Would you like us to pay a certain amount into a community fund? Like, what would make it okay for me to do this? So I think like a good example of a data center would have at a bare minimum those characteristics. And then to start to touch on the second question, what an energy situation around a data center would look like in New York, there's actually a group of people working on it. I'm pretty sure that it's called like the Sustainable Data Centers Act or something that's in the New York State legislature.
That sounds right.
Something
We'll go
like
with
that. Yes, if you look it up, something similar to that should come up. But there's actually a first draft of a bill kind of proposing what like a more positive vision for data center build out could look like specifically in New York that I'd encourage you to take a look at and see if that helps answer your question better than I could from here.
So I'm skeptical that there are ideal places for a data center just because of the way they're engineered currently. How you have to cool uses currently, the way things are engineered, uses water. That water doesn't go back necessarily at the same rate into the system as it came in, right? So there's loss, water loss. You don't get that back, right? Unless we some data centers said we're going to start seeding clouds and making it rain more. I don't think that's going to happen. So how they're currently created, how they're currently designed, it's not. It's just. No, it's not ideal, right? But also how they pollute, the off gassing, right? Rip to our EPA, right? We had at times, really strong air pollution standards. We need to perhaps rethink those again, right? So currently, I'm skeptical that there's an ideal place for data centers and other connected industry areas. So, well, I mean, there's like space pollution too. So, yeah. So.
Space junk. Yeah. Yeah, they are trying to put data centers on the moon, but okay, like, I'll believe it when I see it. But rocket fuel is also really polluting. So
Like
there's all kinds of
shooting up particulate
it's hard to get
matter
up
all
there.
the way.
The maintenance will be kind of carbon intensive, I think. Yeah. I think I see another hand over here.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. From a background standpoint, I'm a former Wall Street analyst that covered natural gas and electric utilities. I've been out of the field for about 20 years now, but I know we're good in this country at building things, but not always good at maintaining them. And the power grid, when I was covering that sector, was always a concern that there's too much strain on the power grid. We can end up with rolling blackouts, brownouts. Is that still from an engineering, Sanjana, is that, you probably know more about that now in the current state, is that still a big concern? And the pressure that these data centers might cause on the grid if they don't have their own power source aligned with the projects, is that a concern that we'll see more rolling blackouts and brownouts with this type of thing?
Great question. It is already happening, actually. So this past summer in Northern Virginia, again, which is the home to Data Center Alley, there were rolling blackouts in some areas of Northern Virginia. So yeah, I mean, the grid is like not in a great place because exactly as you said, we don't do basic maintenance on it. It's in the public interest to do that, and we don't. And so even without this huge additional load from data centers, we were already like not doing so hot. And in other regions like California, where there's also like increased risk of like wildfires from old malfunctioning grid, like I think that like on the basis of grid infrastructure alone, we could be saying pump the brakes. This is such a bad idea. Like, why can we not address the basic underlying infrastructure? So to go back to the first question, this is a large part of why I have a huge issue with data center development right now, is because we're steamrolling ahead here and kind of these basic preconditions of do people have energy before the data centers? Can the grid work before the data centers? We haven't addressed any of those. So like in a single answer to your question, yeah, no, it's a problem.
Hi. Yeah, I've been thinking about, I think this is especially relevant to Jasmine's work on rural AI, like how there are areas in which, there's not great connectivity, or maybe there's not great, banking resources, and then these tech companies come in with Starlink or Bitcoin or WorldCoin and so on. So I guess like as communities that are always going to be less, at least financially resourced than these companies, like how do we prevent that from happening in areas where there is this genuine need that then is filled by these tech companies with these these offerings that do actually like meet that need but end up creating this system of dependency?
Yeah, I don't know if they actually do meet the need though. I think they promise to meet a need or certain specific things, but it always comes with a price, right? And both actual monetary prices, but in this case, we're thinking environmental, health-wise, labor-wise, changing the whole, I think, larger environment, I don't just mean like flora, fauna, but like environment of a town or a community for whether it's to do with zoning or just other laws that make certain places attractive, right? But cost the communities, right? I think we talked about power. There needs to be a real concerted effort against powerful things that parachute into communities and change the landscape. That has to do, I think, a lot with, we want to have a conversation about lobbying and those kinds of issues. But that's a connected issue, right? Who has power, who has money, who can donate, who can, put in infrastructure that a community needs. And what's the cost, though, of that? Monetary, but the cost to the community about ways of life and also environment and public health and those things.
I have one back here. Still go.
Hello. I guess given the lack of enforcement interest and some of the administrative rollbacks of federal environmental legislation, are you seeing state agencies stepping up under state law to actually mount any challenges? Are the companies building these data centers, do you find they're like forum shopping for friendlier territories, I guess, that are lax around the environmental laws and enforcement?
Yeah, so it has been interesting to watch how this is playing out at the state level because, first of all, there are a lot of states that are even, deep red states that were very invested in renewable energy infrastructure. And we've seen a lot of pushback on data center development, even in states like Indiana. So, I think there is an opportunity here. So places like Texas, which of course also really have grid problems, are going to be a friendlier development environment for tech companies, including, Elon Musk, right, was able to build his little company town in the town from which he launches his rockets. But I think what we're seeing is that other states are really rallying to put out bills that will protect constituents. So in California, there's a number of bills, and I believe one just passed. I haven't been able to catch up on the news while I'm here. But certainly, as we already mentioned, the bill in Oregon that protected ratepayers. There's a ton of legislation that is still, some of it still pending in Virginia. There's, pretty much legislation in every single state right now, both at the more community or municipal level and at the statewide level. So, I think while we're certainly seeing a federal environment where essentially in any environmental protections that were in place and things like environmental review processes are being cut and curtailed, permitting is being stripped away in terms of the oversight that would ordinarily oversee the process. But the truth is that it still takes a long time to actually build stuff in a lot of cases. So even with the attempts at rapid expansion, there are just material barriers to actually getting this stuff done. And so I think there is still room for pushback.
Right here.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you how you feel about using the technology to better navigate the issues that you've raised. I'm an author, and for me, copyright breach was a big thing, and I actually found it more illuminating to talk with the machine about those issues than with actual copyright lawyers. So, I learned more from it.
I can get started. Yeah, first, right, like to each their own. I think that it's kind of, there's this really interesting parallel, I think, to like the plastic industry, you know, where like there's a lot of individual pressure to be like, how many water bottles have you consumed this year? When really we should be pointing our finger at the plastic company and being like, how many plastic water bottles have you produced this year? What? You know, so I think like an individual person typing in a single query into like a chat bot is not going to make me lose any sleep. But I also just kind of urge caution and common sense and fact checking, because you know chatbots like ChatGPT are large language models, and there was, I think, a recent paper. I can't remember which tech company it came from because I feel like I'm swimming in articles about like these papers from tech companies, but a recent one basically saying that like hallucinations, so like false information, because large language models, they're predicting, right, that like, oh, it's likely that if this person put in this string of text, this word after this word after this word after this word, it's likely that I should say this word after this word after this word after this word. This paper, you know, concluded that like hallucinations, made up info is like a mathematical inevitability. So I would just say, again, right, like do what you want, but be informed about it. If you found it illuminating, you know, and were able to use that as a positive step in your journey, great. Just fact check everything that, you know, that came out of there. I've tried it several times, you know, because I want to understand. I want to know what I'm up against. I'm a grad student. I feel I face a lot of pressure actually to use like generative AI tools. But like at my core, I'm kind of a hater, and I just don't want to give like, I just don't want to support like the dudes who are behind these companies, you know? So that's my take.
Back here. All right, back over here.
We have time for a few more.
I actually had a question around the kind of consumer side of Gen AI, and I totally agree and empathize with, like, I don't know, fast fashion, Shein, like the issues ultimately with the production of it. But I think there's also the reality that there is the consumer demand, given the kind of like how lowly they're priced, et cetera. So I'm curious in terms of like what a sustainable economic model of AI would look like. Would it be that people would have to pay to use it as well? But because there is just like so much usage of it that's grown so much, that I'm sure is also promoting some aspect, but not all aspects of the data center just being built.
I'll go a little. I mean, yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think the problem of consumer demand, I mean, part of it is also that AI, generative AI specifically, is being integrated into so many things that we use all the time without our consent. And it can be very difficult to change settings to avoid AI results, even if you don't want them. And also, you know, I had an issue with my baggage with United the other day, and I was talking to the chatbot, and, you know, I was like, give me the fucking human. Give me the fucking human. And then it's like, I don't understand your response. I'm sorry. Do you need one of these 5 menu options? And I think this is also the problem. Like in a lot of cases, we're being force-fed AI models that are not actually very equipped to do the thing that they're purportedly doing. And then they're also putting people out of jobs. And so I think there is something to be said, though, that, you know, a lot of people are using generative AI, obviously, for a lot of different things. But eventually, looking at the economic model anyway, I think that people are going to end up having to pay for it. The current way that AI is being funded is also not sustainable. So I think, you know, that will be the reality for a lot of the AI products that people are used to now.
I would just like to add that AI companies are also advertising companies. If we look at like how AI has been, and generative AI in particular has been sold to people, how it's been framed as this like panacea for finding out information, summarizing information. I have to tell students like, listen, no, just like you know, it's sold to people as this great thing. It's framed as this really important and useful, and so it can be some of those things, but at the same time, the sell is you have to use it. you're pressured to use it. If you're not using it, you're going to be left behind in, at work and at school. And so there's pressure to use it. So consumers are using it because they feel like they have to use it because it's been sold as such. So I would just add that into the conversation about consumerism as well.
Okay, last question. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. I'm wondering I'm from a community level, as someone actively engaged in this fight in Louisiana, in Memphis, what are some ways in which we can share what's actually happening? How can we cut through some of this noise and let folks know, hey, we are down here, we are fighting this thing. It's not as inevitable as it feels.
Yeah, so social media is still really a really good and useful tool for organizing and for telling the story. So you want to tell the story what's happening in Memphis, you want to tell the story what's happening in Louisiana. Social media has still been a really great place. Now, the places where you tell that story, you have to choose wisely, but people are getting that word out, organizing the more local news, like Mississippi Free Press and those local nonprofit funded news are really building audiences on different social media sites that are telling the stories about data centers, about AI pollution and harms. And so I think those places are still good places, but also those third places in the communities, the libraries, the barbershops and salons, those other places that we have forgotten a lot about, but are still super useful for telling the story and organizing and getting people, equipped to deal with stuff.
That's all the time we have. If you guys want to wrap up.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was excited. I was ready. Like, let's do some public education, including what we're doing right now. But yeah, so today I think we had a really interesting conversation that, touched on the idea that AI is an ecology, that we have to think about the labor conditions and the materials that go into the production of AI, as well as the applications of AI and its ramifications in the material world. We were also thinking about AI as an infrastructure and thinking about the relationship between generative AI, data centers in particular, as these sites where we really see the relationship between natural resources and energy, water, critical minerals, and the technology that we're increasingly being asked to use every day. And then finally, the idea that AI is really about power. And it's also, not just about the power that big tech companies have or utility companies like PG&E is who we really hate in California, thinking about the power that they have, but then also the power that we have. And so, what does it mean to fight back against a handful of billionaires who are determining what the Earth's resources are being used for right now? And I think we have covered a number of different options that people can take in order to really think about organizing in their own communities, whatever they may look like. So thank you all.